Hello, we're glad you joined us for this live webinar, Creating and Maintaining an Effective and Efficient In Vivo Surgical Training Program. I am Christina Mahalik of LabRoots, and I'll be moderating this session. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots, the leading scientific social networking website and provider of virtual events and webinars advancing scientific collaboration and learning. To visit more, visit labroots.com. Let's get started. You can post questions to the speaker during the presentation while they're fresh in your mind. To do so, simply type them in the Q&A box, which will open when you click on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. Questions will be answered after the presentation. To enlarge the slide window, click on the screen icon in the lower right-hand corner of the slide window. If you experience technical problems seeing or hearing the presentation, just click on the support button found at the top right of the presentation window, or report your problem by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the screen. This is an educational web seminar. Thus, it offers free continuing education credits. After the webinar is over, please click on the CE button located in the bottom left-hand corner of your webpage and follow the process of obtaining your credits. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Matthew Flegel, Surgical Research Specialist, Senior Associate Scientist, In-vivo Resource Center, Biogen. Matt entered the research field over 24 years ago as a lab animal surgical technician at the TSI Mason Contract Research Facility. Since then, he has worked at contract facilities such as TSI and OREAD Biosafety, as well as in industry at Pharmacia, Pfizer, Genzyme, Sanofi Aventis, and Biogen. During that period, he has performed a variety of surgical procedures, including device implantations, transplants, orthopedic defect, ocular and vascular implants, cardiac surgery, and brain and spinal procedures. His experience ranges from mice and rats to non-human primates and livestock. In addition, he holds 4 patents of novel surgical devices and implants and has trained over 900 technicians, scientists, veterinarians, and physicians in surgical techniques and procedures for over 20 years. He has also taught several webinars for the Veterinary Bioscience Institute, including a 3-part rodent stereotactic surgery and 14-part surgery for technicians courses. Outside of the surgical realm, he has been a study director, echocardiographer, safety pharmacologist, scientist, and manager. Currently, Matt supervises a team of associates at Biogen who conduct surgical and non-surgical studies, along with being the lead surgical trainer for all in vivo staff. Matt was on the board of the directors of the Academy of Surgical Research for over 10 years, serving as their program chair for 3 of them, as well as educational chair for 2. Currently, he's the program chairman for the New England branch of ALAS. Mr. Flegel will now begin his presentation. The floor is yours.
All right. Just before we get started, I would like to say thank you very much to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk about something that is very near and dear to my heart. And also all of the people who are taking time out from, I have no doubt, very busy days to attend, watch, and hopefully ask a lot of really good questions throughout the course of this presentation. So I've got a lot to talk about, so let us get started. We're going to be talking about training programs, and in my opinion, training programs are some of the most critical aspects of what we do when it comes to in vivo work within our vivarium. They're critical. If you do the techniques well, then you tend to get good data, good scientific assessments out of it, can move your drugs to market, you can move your devices forward, you can continue your basic research and come up with things that will be useful for we as a field. However, one of the things that we frequently struggle with is we often have teachers and instructors who don't have any formal training in teaching. Something that we wouldn't I would not be happy if my daughter, when she was in kindergarten, was getting training from someone with no experience in teaching. We do that all the time in this field, up to and including cardiovascular surgery transplants. What makes it a little bit more difficult is surgery covers a whole number of areas. It covers anesthesia, it covers aseptic technique, good tissue handling, etc., etc. We have to cover a lot when we're teaching our students. So I'm going to talk for the majority of this presentation on how do you put together your training program so that it functions as effectively as possible. And it's going to be a series of questions, really, that you need answered. And my biggest piece of advice to anyone doing this, do your homework. Answer your questions first and then design your program. And many of us, if not all of us, who've been involved in these types of training programs, we've all experienced that rather dubious joy of you don't have time to do that, or at least you don't feel that you have time to do that. So you start a program and then you're desperately trying to fix it and tweak it, sometimes for years. If you can give yourself that time, maybe even only a week or two, to answer these questions first, the program that you put into place will probably be pretty good, and you won't require a lot of your very valuable and very scarce time to make the improvements that you need for it to function properly. So it's dependent on a bunch of things. What are the regulations and guidelines? Who are you teaching? What are the resources you have? What's the training staff that you have? Make a realistic assessment of all of those. Don't guess, don't make your, this doesn't look good if I admit the following. Be realistic, because you're going to be stuck working with all of these, regardless of whether you're willing to admit it or not. Regulations and guidelines. We've all read them. We have internal SOPs, we have guidance documents, we have various federal regulations and guidelines. Are you ALAC certified? So on and so forth. That's only the first step. How are they applied in your facility? What are the expectations to work in your vivarium? And then how are they applied in the student's lab? Is every student's lab held to the same standard? Do they have the same functionality? Do they have the same SOPs? They probably differ from each other, and you need to know that so that you can prepare your students properly. As a trainer, as a training group, what's your authority? What's your responsibility? Do people have to listen to you? Can you just lay down the law, or are you going to have to convince and bring people along and build up more of a bond of trust to be able to get your students to do things properly? Or the gray areas. Identify those. Develop a proactive plan. Don't wait for things to go wrong, because then you're desperately scrambling to make a fix. Chances are it's not going to be nearly as good as if you took the time at the outset and identified the areas that questions may arise from. Come up with your answers. What are your responses going to be? Documentation requirements. How are you going to document your training program? Who's going to be looking at it? What are you going to be using it for? Your students. Who are you training? What are their backgrounds? Are you training physicians? Are you training technicians? Are you training people with 20 years of experience or 2 months of experience? What's their scientific background? Some of the best surgeons I have ever trained, I hired directly out of facility operations, out of cage watch, and they were fantastic. But they might not have the scientific background that your PhD students have. Doesn't mean they can't be outstanding surgeons, but it means you're going to have to teach them in a more involved fashion, and probably a little bit more. Give them resources. What's their interest? Do your students want to be there? We'll talk about that in a little bit, but interest is so important, and if you haven't set your program up to take into account whether your students want to be there or not, you may well fail. What's their relative position in the organization? I've had people who came in who were VPs. I really can't tell a VP what to do. there's a power disparity there. It doesn't mean that you can't be an effective teacher, and it doesn't mean that they can't be a very effective student. But hierarchy does matter. Who are you going to be faced with? Your students' availability. Can you get them into training? How often are they there? Are they running assays for 9 hours a day, 4 days a week? How much can you get a hold of them? How much can they be in that training room? Because here's the point. The student is the point. Everything in this program that you're going to be putting together or administering depends on them. If you don't have students and they're not learning properly, then your program is a failure. It's not accomplishing anything. What are their needs and how can you meet them? And again, be realistic. I'll try not to repeat that too many times moving forward, but just keep it in the back of your head. Always be realistic, even if only to yourself. Admit what you're going to be dealing with and develop realistic approaches to handling them. But if your students, understand their motivation. Because all of us have been on that. All of us have been the person getting trained. Many of us are still getting trained on things. Put yourself in their head. They're under great pressure to produce. They were hired to produce study data. They were hired to execute these procedures. And they're under a tremendous amount of pressure to do so. And that leads to anxiety. Their group is looking at them. Their boss wants them to be working a week ago. They're constantly asking them, where are you at? How are you doing? When can you start working on study? Those of us who have been experienced surgeons, there's a real anxiety that comes in because now all the stuff that you said when you were at your interview, now you have to back it up. And your students are in that same position. They have to back up everything that they said. If they said, I'm an outstanding rodent surgeon, now they have to prove it. That's a tremendous amount of anxiety. They don't want to fail. They may be in a completely different situation. Did their previous place hold them to a higher standard, a lower standard, just a different standard? All of that is weighing on them. Because no one wants to be embarrassed. No one has to admit failure or struggles, especially to their new boss, especially to their new group. For many surgeons, certainly many that I've trained, they don't want to be surgeons. It's not their goal. They didn't go to school to become a surgeon. It wasn't a driving goal from the time that they were in childhood. They want to be biochemists. They want to be an oncologist. They want to research new forms of attacking fibrosis. They want to tackle Alzheimer's. Surgery is just a tool. It's just a way for them to accomplish their research. Their passion is their research, not the methodology that they're using to get there. They're also not in control of their own process, right? We're controlling it to a large extent. We've set up the structure. They have to work with us. And that's anxiety provoking because now they're putting their whole career in the hands of us. And they probably don't know us. They probably never met us before they started this training program. So they're completely dependent on someone they don't know. They have no idea if we're good at what we do. They have no idea if we're decent as surgeons. They're at our mercy. That's anxiety provoking. Some of the steps that I use, demystify it. Yeah, surgery is an art, but it's an achievable art, all right? I tend in my training sessions to call it organic chemistry, organic carpentry. We're taking things apart, we're putting them together. They just happen to be biologic instead of a piece of inert wood or some other material. If your student has decent hand-eye coordination, relatively stable hands, and is willing to learn, is engaged in the process, you can teach them surgery. And that engaged brain is going to compensate for a lot. I put down there, that's a endocide anastomosis that one of my students did right out of cage wash. They did a fantastic job. I have video. I apologize I didn't put it in. You can watch it pulsating beautifully. Again, demystify it. You know, we talk about things. We're going to do a myocardial infarction of the mouse. We're going to do a kidney transplant. And we as surgeons are really invested in convincing everyone that what we do is unbelievably complicated, complex. My God, we're the elite. No one can do what we do. Really? We tell people that don't even bother making the attempt. You can't do it. It's so hard. We're so good. Really? Take the myocardial infarction. I'm going to make an incision in the chest with scissors, maybe a scalpel, depending on the size of the animal. I'm going to make an incision between the ribs. I'm going to retract the ribs. I'm going to identify the heart. I'm going to incise the pericardium. So basically at this point, I've done retraction and I've made incisions. 2 skills. I'm going to stabilize the heart. Let's be charitable and call that a 3rd skill. I'm going to put a suture around the coronary artery. Okay, that's suturing. And then I'm going to close the tissues behind me with a series of either single interrupted, continuous, subcuticular, etc. So I've made incisions, I've done tissue retraction, I've placed sutures. 3 skills. And yes, there are aseptic principles, there's anesthesia and analgesia, that you make incisions, you're dissecting. Yeah, there are other things in it, but at its core, that's a really small number of things that your student has to learn. If they take the time, if they use that admittedly fairly limited set of surgical skills, that covers a lot of procedures. So long as they're willing to focus, they have the intent, and they're willing to practice. The art of surgery, where experience comes in, where higher level training comes in, is knowing when to take those basic techniques and how to apply them and how to modify them, when to modify them. But at the early stages, it's just a series of basic techniques. What are your resources? Your instructors, your facilities, your equipment, the animals. You have to practice on them. What protocols do you have? What are your supplies? What are your references? And I'm going to talk about references a fair amount because those can really save you a tremendous amount of time. So for your instructors, basic questions. But I'll tell you, I've put together programs before I thought to address these, and it cost me. It cost me dearly. And it made it so much more difficult for myself and the other instructors. How many do you have? No, really. How many do you have? Not hypothetically, there are 50 people in your group who can do it. Realistically, how many can you call on reliably? What's their background? I've been teaching surgery for a very long time. Some days it seems longer than others. I was training new technicians on basic surgical procedures when I had been in the field for a little bit less than 3 years. I didn't know what I was doing. I was perfectly capable of demonstrating what I did. But that's not teaching. I'm just showing them what I do and hoping that they pick it up. So background is important. What's their experience? Oftentimes in these fields, we have new techniques come in. We have people who we have to validate for a procedure that we've never done. How are you going to address that? Is that going to come up? And are they any good as trainers? There are bad trainers out there. Many of us were at best mediocre trainers. Hopefully we learned a bit over the years, but there are lots of bad trainers out there. There are lots of mediocre ones. There are lots of them that are too stretched. You can still use them, and you can use them effectively, but answer that at the outset because that drives a lot of your structure. Because here's the thing. Teaching is a craft. It requires work. It requires training. It requires your self-evaluation, evaluation of others on how you are doing, mental flexibility, willingness to adjust. It is hard work to be a good teacher. And if you have a good trainer, a good instructor out there, they weren't born fully formed from the head of Zeus. They had to learn it. They had to focus on it. And it is a craft. And if you want to be a good teacher, you're going to have to work at it forever. It never ends. You can always be better. And in this field, we don't pick trainers because of teaching skills. We pick them because they are the best person in the lab to do a procedure. This person can do a carotid artery cannulation on a 18-gram mouse better than anyone I've seen. Doesn't mean that they can teach it. Doesn't mean that they can explain what they're doing. It just means that technically they're very strong. These are 2 different skill sets. It's good to have both. But a lot of times we rely on the technical skill set and not the teaching skill set. Are you teaching your instructors how to teach? Are you training your trainers? If you're putting together a new program, who certifies the first trainer? Who says this is the person who can teach everybody else? It's chicken and the egg. You have to start somewhere to answer these questions. And be realistic in your assessment of your teaching pool. Some instructors are Yoda. Some instructors are Kenobi. If you're a Star Wars fan, you know how well that worked out. So be realistic. You can set up structure to counterbalance. We'll talk about that in a bit. But systematize your teacher evaluation. Have a process, have a form, have a survey, have a way to go back to your trainees. How do things work? Do you check on them 6 months later? Think about these things and put them into your structure. Use metrics. As I've gotten older, so many of the corporate buzzwords that I used to laugh at have actually started to make sense. I'm not entirely sure what that says about me as I've continued in the field, but there are reasons. Metrics are there for a reason. They're a way to evaluate how things are going, how your performance is going. Simple ones, from sign-off time, from initiation, how long does that take? Can you get that time down? How many post-training complications do your students have? Do you track that? Or do you sign them off and wish them well and hope for the best? Maybe that's okay. Maybe you don't have the resources to track that. But you may be in a situation where someone asks you that question, and it's nice if you've answered it ahead of time. Again, satisfaction surveys, scoring, I like just going to talk to them. Honestly, surveys and scoring, you're lucky if you get 10% responses. Just go to their office. How did it go? How do you feel it went? What can we do better? Sorry, my screen seems to have frozen. There we go. So instructors, you can use mediocre or inexperienced teachers. That picture down at the bottom, that was me. That was me really, really long time ago. I was teaching surgery at that point. I've been in the field for less than 3 years. And I was able to be moderately effective at it. But it's because the program that I was a part of realized my limitations and used me appropriately. So they relied on other materials. Nowadays, we rely a lot on videos, extra resources. I can't convey the information well. So give out handouts. Use online things. Conferences like this, things like Veterinary Bioscience Institute, things like ALAS Learning Libraries, YouTube. There is so much good material. There's a lot of really bad material, but there's lots of good instructional material on YouTube. Find them, use them. Transfer the information that way if your teachers simply are too inexperienced to do it effectively themselves. Standardize things. All your trainers are teaching the same thing. Give them structure. Allow them to execute a program. Flexibility is wonderful in a teacher, but if you're not experienced enough to convey it well, then that's how you get into traps and you teach things that are incorrect. You get your students into trouble. You focus on results. Did their animals live? Were they pain-free? Was the procedure successful? You know what? Maybe I, as an inexperienced teacher, that's not how I would have done that subcutaneous pattern, but it worked. And I may not know enough to realize that there are 100 different ways to do it, and your student did a perfectly acceptable one. But since I'd never seen it before, to me it looks wrong. And that you set those expectations up front. Don't be afraid to tell the stakeholders in the process. My training crew is relatively inexperienced. They're relatively young. It's okay. But tell people what you're dealing with and let your stakeholders know what they're going to be dealing with so that they don't have surprises. Facilities. How many surgical stations and ORs do you have? Are they available for training or are they always in use? If you reserve them, are you going to get bumped? That happens a lot. I reserve training. This is a critical project. It wins. So take those into account. Are there blocks that I can set up? No one uses these on Thursday afternoons. That's when we're doing training. Are they well maintained, or are you going to walk in there and have to budget an hour just to clean the place up before you can do training? And are there alternatives? Can you do things in procedure rooms? Can you do cadavers in necropsy? What options do you have if the facility space itself is limited? Equipment's in the same thing. Is it available? Can you actually get to it? Can you reserve it? If you reserve it, will it actually be there? Maybe you're going to get lucky. Maybe your students use that equipment already. If the vast majority of your students, you're not training them on a new procedure, it's something that they've been doing, then you're just validating that they're doing it to your own internal standards. Maybe you don't have to teach them how to use that syringe pump or how to use that stereotaxic device. Is it the same as in their lab? I used to make this mistake a fair amount until it finally beat me up enough that I stopped. I would train people on equipment and they'd go back to their lab, and I was so proud of my shiny new equipment, which is great, until they had to go back and work with something that's 15 years old in their lab and outside of basic function didn't match what I trained them on at all. Are there backups? Something breaks. Is your whole training session washed? Is there something that you can substitute in? Do you know where it is? Again, questions to ask yourself. What I really talk about a lot when I train my own trainers is set yourself up for success. Stack the deck, have everything ready so things can go wrong and your students don't notice because you have contingency plans. Animals. Do you have the species and strain available? I've done a lot of teaching with surgery in dogs and non-human primates, and they're not just sitting around, and they're difficult to use for training. So again, there are ways that we can work around that, but you need at the outset to go, you know what, I can't use 30 non-human primates, cynomolgus monkeys, for my training program per student. Can't afford it, they're not available, and quite honestly, it's really bad use of animal lives. Can you use cadavers? Are cadavers available? It does you no good to teach basic surgery on a cadaver because you euthanize them all the time, and they're harvested for tissues, and they're in formalin, and they're useless to you. Can you substitute more available species and strains? Can you use a rat cadaver instead of a live primate for suturing or tissue dissection or what have you? The 3 R's, where can you avoid using them? There is a ton of stuff out there that you can use for a lot of this training that doesn't require you to use animals. 3D Med has a whole series of wonderful suture plates and silicone molds and all the rest that you can use. There are journal articles out there for casting skulls in resin and using those for stereotaxic approaches, so we don't have to euthanize animals for no reason. Protocols. What are you going to do this summer? Do you have a training protocol? Are you going to use study protocols? Because how many times, those of you who've been doing this for a while, how many times have we had protocols not written yet because we hired this person to bring this new capability online? So they're still writing the protocol. You can't train under a non-existent protocol. Maybe you can if you have a training protocol, but what are you going to use for all of this? When someone comes to you and says, I want to do something that has never been done in this company before, how will you set it up so that you can get them working as quickly as possible? What's the level of veterinary oversight? Can you use veterinary oversight? Can you use a veterinary consult to work around some of these roadblocks? Hopefully, but you need to have those answers up front. Supplies. They can be expensive. Suture is not cheap. Are they even available in the lab? Can or should you use substitutions? And there's a financial cost there. What is your program going to cost? Because I can tell you that many of us have set up what seem like really wonderful programs. They were really internally expensive. And a year or two down the line, when your vice president or your director is asking you, why are you spending $50,000 on a training program? You better have an answer. And more importantly, did you need to spend it? Maybe you did. But have that answer up front and discuss it with your VP and your director. Have their buy-in, have them on board before they get the sticker shock. References. There are pre-existing ones. Again, Jove, YouTube, VBI, virtual lab conferences, etc. Reference books, presentations, lots of presentations. If you ever are stuck for, especially when it comes to anesthesia and analgesia, most major state universities have all of their stuff online. Use it. Don't sand the serial numbers off, please. As someone who has both seen it and experienced it, if you're going to use someone's resources, then at least attribute it to them. Don't sand the serial numbers off, put your name on it, and say, I developed a 70-page, anesthesia book. But within those constraints, use them. But then create your own. In my current department, we make a lot of training videos. They save so much time. They save so many animal lives. If I demonstrate a surgical procedure on a video, I use 2 or 3 animals. It takes a decent amount of time, but then I never have to demo it again. My students can watch it at their leisure. So when they show up for hands-on training, they're ready. They've seen it. They don't have to sit there for half an hour watching me do it. I don't have to spend an hour setting up for it before they show up. Make your own cheat sheets, your own flow charts. Here's how the procedure works. Do this, then do this, then do this. Use this suture. Put your reminders in. We do a lot of stuff with intranet presentations. We have teaching modules. They are a huge help. Use them. Once you've answered these questions, then you can design your program, because now you know the parameters, now you know the constraints, now you know the resources, you know the students, you know the types that you're going to be dealing with, you know the levels of experience they're going to bring to the table, you know the levels of experience that you're bringing to the table. Put all of that together, and oftentimes your program comes into focus pretty quickly, because those constraints are going to set the boundaries. They're going to set the structure. They're going to set the borderlines. If you don't have those, then you're guessing. Don't guess. Maybe you'll be better at it than I am, but I will tell you that typically when I guess wrong. And it takes you a week to set it up properly, or you spend months trying to fix it. And work with the stakeholders. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make, not just in setting up a program, but in administering it, is they don't talk to stakeholders. Stakeholders isn't your group necessarily. It's not your VP, it's not your director, it's not your manager, it's not the rest of the training staff. Stakeholders are the people who are depending on you to train their personnel to get to work in their labs. They're paying that person a lot of money to do work for them. They're the stakeholders. They're the people that you should be involving in this process. I wouldn't recommend going to talk to them before you've answered these questions, because then if there's any pushback, you have no argument, you have no data. But if you do have it, then you have data. Then you can have a real discussion on, here's what I can do, here's what I have, here's what I can accomplish. It's where transparency comes in. Don't overpromise, underpromise. Let them know what's going on. Let them know the constraints. Let them know the problems. Be honest with them. Because nothing makes a stakeholder, and I've had people reporting to me. I've been that stakeholder. I don't want to find out 2 months into the process that there's been a problem, and it's too late to fix it, or we've wasted 2 months of my new hire's time. And my time, my research is dependent on them. I justified that position based on the work that they're going to do. We need them to be doing it now. So don't forget them. Don't just talk internally. Talk to the people you're doing the work for. So if you've done all of that, with any luck, you have a decent program. Well, let's take a couple of examples. Let's take the extremes. First example, I've got 2 trainees a year. They work in my group. They work in my department. I schedule their time so they're available whenever I want them to be. And I've got 2 personnel as trainers, and one is really experienced and one is fairly inexperienced and new. Example 2, I get 50 plus trainees a year, and they're scattered throughout the company. They work in a whole host of different departments. And many of them are at higher rank within the org chart than my trainers or me. And they're not dedicated training staff. They're also responsible. How many times have all of us seen that? They're not just trainers, they're also surgeons. They're also running their own studies. They're also doing their own research. And let's make it a little bit more complicated. Your trainers are relatively green. You can't spare the really experienced people. You're using the people who've been doing surgery for 4, maybe 5 years. Those are going to require completely different approaches because they're different. And they're going to define the purpose of the program. If you have all of those, then you design what fits best. You're going to maximize the impact of your most available resources and also your least available resources. If the structure's not right, get what's in the picture. Everything falls apart. And it always takes more time to fix something than it takes to build it properly in the first place. Again, I've been corporatized over the years. I apologize in advance, but some of the buzzwords really do matter. And mission statements matter. They clarify the goal of your program, and they force you to think. It's easy to come up with a 17-page proposal, but if you have to define everything that your training program is going to do in 1 to 3 sentences, if it's too complicated for you to do that, then it's probably complicated enough that it's going to be really, really unwieldy. So it's going to clarify things, and also you can give that to your stakeholders. They now know your mission statement. So here are 2. We're going to train surgeons to perform advanced procedures independently with minimal veterinary supervision. That's 1. Second, we're going to efficiently train surgeons to perform common surgical procedures using appropriate aseptic technique and surgical skills. That's going to result in completely different approaches and time commitments. If you look at the first one, I'm training independent surgeons. So I can't just train them on a couple of procedures and allow them to just follow that flow chart. They're just going to do it by rote. As long as they don't deviate from what we said, they're probably going to be okay. They have to be able to think through problems. They have to be able to do method development. That's going to take a lot of time. And you better get really, really engaged students, or none of that will work. But a lot of us have programs that focus more on the other side. My surgeons that I'm training are going to do a fairly limited number of procedures. And what I need to do is I need to prepare them to do that well, to maintain decent aseptic technique, decent surgical skills, to get good data out the far end and have good animal welfare. But they don't have to be stellar surgeons. And one of the mistakes I made early on is because I'm a surgical geek. I love surgery. There's a reason I've been doing it this long. And so you couldn't give me enough training. Give me another opportunity. I want to take advantage of it. You have another reference? I want to read it. And I tried to train early on in my training career people who are just like that. And when they're not, it doesn't work. And perhaps more importantly, they didn't need it. They don't have to learn everything there is to know about surgery because they're not going to use those skills. Again, to them, it's a tool. I do stereotaxic injections into the lateral ventricle because it gets my compound into the brain, and then I see what happens. Stereotaxis is just a means to an end, and I'm not going to be doing additional types of procedures, and maybe in 4 or 5 years when I need to, I'll come back for more training. So for that first one, fairly straightforward. Set up your skill set requirements for the employees. What do they need to learn? What timetable do you want them to learn it on? Set up your standards. What are your competency criteria? How do you know that they've been successful? What are your resources? What's their availability? And then schedule them. Put them in. Assign the training sessions, document appropriately, and off you go. Example 2, much harder. You're an assembly line person, but you're an assembly line teaching people really delicate, sometimes challenging skills. And you may have a mixed program where some of those people are going to have to be high-level surgeons. It's going to be more difficult, both because of the throughput and because your training resources are going to be constrained. You'll never have enough to run that program the way you optimally would like. But that's okay. It doesn't mean that it can't be effective. What are your most constrained resources? And that is almost always trainer and trainee time, because you've got to put them in the same room together. So never mind the fact that both of them are busy and it's difficult to draw them in. They also have to sync up their calendar. You have to put them physically in the same room. And for those of us who've done it, we all know that can be a real challenge. So you're going to have to push as much out of those sessions as possible. What can you do that doesn't require a student and a trainer sitting in a room together? Put those written standards together, have that training progression, give it to the students, give it to the managers so they know exactly what they're in for, they know what the commitments are, and they know what they are committing to. Don't leave it open-ended. Don't leave it vague. Let them know. I need you to be there every week. or it will require 10 sessions with me to get through on this procedure. So if you can come at twice a week, we'll get you through in a little over a month. If you can come once a month, it's going to be a year. Set that up ahead of time. And again, transparency, transparency, transparency. Be honest. This is what it's going to take. This is what I can do. What do you need? How can I accomplish that? Can I accomplish that? If you don't talk, if you're a black box, you're a roadblock. Because all the student sees is this person isn't getting me through the process. And I'm not getting to work, and my lab is getting upset with me. I'm not holding up my weight. I'm not proving myself. And that relationship can go sour really, really quickly. So what can you batch train? You know, it's difficult to train people on procedures. I've done big classes when it comes to actual surgical technique, and I'm not a fan of it. I personally feel that if I have more than 3, maybe 4 students at any one time, I'm not giving any of them enough attention. Now, if I'm validating experienced surgeons, that may work. But if they're new surgeons or these are new techniques, they're sitting in a room with me, but I'm really not teaching them because I just don't have the time. I'm pulled in too many directions. But there are things you can set up. Didactic, anything. Here's how you set up an anesthesia machine. Here are the standards for postoperative care. The assessments, let me hasten to add, that takes focused training. But here's what you need to look for. Here are the generalities. What are your aseptic practices? What are aseptic practices? Many of your students may never have heard that word before. What are the regulations? How do you do basic instrument handling? What are the basic instruments? How do you sterilize, etc.? But if you are sitting in a room and you can present to that many people, then stop wasting your time. Make a video of it. Find a way to make that available. Because even if you can batch train 10 students in a 2-hour lecture, it's still 2 hours of your time that could be better served doing that one-on-one hands-on training. It's also more difficult for the student because that's 2 hours that they have to make to be in the same room together. I am a huge fan of online training resources. It's better for you as a trainer because it preserves your scarce time. Once you've set it up, it's done. But also for your students, they can do it when they have natural gaps in their schedule. It works for everybody. And again, if you can't do that, put together presentations, do handouts. I mean, yes, videos and online modules are probably the optimum, but if you can't do that, that's fine. Put it out there. And again, YouTube, Jove, other things that have videos to teach them how to do a basic suture technique. There are lots of good videos, and I use those extensively. Watch this. Now you've seen it. Now we can go to the hands-on. It also lets them jump in quickly. Students who are interested in what you have to teach them don't want to sit and listen to you talk. They want to get their hands in there. They want to get to work. They want to learn the skills. They don't want to watch someone else do them. So here, they watch it. They get that exposure. They've seen the procedure. Then they actually get to work. And that's far more rewarding for a student than listening to you talk in a conference room for 3 hours. Again, you're constrained. You don't have enough trainers. There are too many people going through for you to really focus on them. So allow students to practice on their own. Set up the training so that we're going to learn basic suturing. You're going to work with me. We're going to go over it. And then as soon as you're good enough to practice independently, off you go. Practice on your own when you can fit it in the schedule, and then come back to me when you've hit certain milestones. And this also, incidentally, is a great weeding out process, because lots of people want to learn surgery, but not a lot of people, comparatively at least, are going to be doing it. But it's cool, and they want to learn it, and it's a good resume builder. And when you set them off on their self-study, and it's going to take 15 hours of their time, you weed out the serious students from the unserious pretty darn quickly. Again, set up those references. Again, do the videos. Did you look like this? And when you're setting up the training, skin edges come together, there are tricks and so on that they can use to assess themselves. Give them that up front, and then let them go off and practice on their own. And it puts the responsibility on them, but it also gives them that sense of control back. Again, it's all about the student. Anything that's not assisting the student learn and get to work, is a waste of time and it's a failure within the system. Are your training resources? Again, when you put a trainer and a trainee in a room together, get the most bang for your buck. Focus on the essentials. Focus on the things that you can't do any other way. And again, give them the updates. Track how are they doing? How long have they been in there? How many sessions? Et cetera, et cetera. Record keeping is critical because someone will ask you to justify why did it take so long. If you didn't record that the student was struggling with a technique, you have no way to justify why maybe it took longer for them. Or why did they get through so quickly when my last person did. So you've done all that work. Wonderful. Now you have to make it better, and now you have to maintain it. Is your program working? Where can you improve it? Again, the benchmark is your students. Are they successful in their lab, or do they require retraining? Did you go back and ask? Because if the training isn't setting them up to do the work successfully in their lab, then that's something that you need to learn and take back into your own training program. My own personal opinion, if you're setting students loose who require retraining in their lab, you're not preparing them well. And you're wasting their lab's time retraining them. And if you think that's not building resentment on their lab mates' part, who have to devote their own scarce time to retraining the person who's been signed off on the procedure by the training group, who's probably viewed as a bit of a roadblock anyways, you're not making friends. Are you keeping metrics? Are you assessing your training staff? Are you seeking feedback? Are you assessing the program? Are you improving your numbers? Is your throughput better? Is your time to sign off going down? Is your cost of the program going down? Is the use of the animals going down? These are things you can measure, and these are things that almost always you can improve. I apologize. I'm from New England. I'm a Patriots fan. But I like Tom Brady in the red shirt because he practices. All quarterbacks, all professionals practice a lot. Do your trainers practice? Do they practice teaching? Are you giving them resources to get better? Or are you just casting them loose saying, now you're a trainer, good luck to you, don't screw any of your students up? Are you making your trainers better? That should be part of your program. How are you making better instructors? How are you preventing drift? If you use example 2, where I've got 4 to 5 instructors and maybe they're never in a room training together, at the end of the year, how do I know that they're still teaching the same things in the same ways to the same standard? Students don't know. If I have an instructor who deviates and decides that gentle tissue handling isn't that important, and you know what, it takes up a lot of time, so I'm not going to focus on it, you've lost that part of your program. Or what if your trainer or your instructor drifts in a positive direction? They figured out a better way to teach this, or their standards are higher, or they're being communicated more effectively. Wouldn't you like to capture that for all of your other instructors? Find that stuff out. Listen to your students. The cliche is there are no bad students. There are, but not a lot of them. I've had very few. I've been very blessed by the people that I've had to train over the years. But by the same token, 900 plus, yeah, I've had a couple that just weren't going to make it. I've had students who I could not sign off for surgery. Usually, though, I found that the students that I would consider bad, they're just unmotivated. It's not that they couldn't do it, it's that they don't want to. And again, it may be they have no interest in this. Or maybe their boss has told them, I want you to learn how to do this, and you'll never use it, but what the heck, it'll be good for you. They have no investment in it. Do you have a way to deal with that? Do you have a way to communicate that? How do you explain to their boss why you're not signing off someone? How do you explain to their boss that you're not signing off someone who, according to their resume, has been doing surgery for 20 years? That's a tough position for a trainer to be in. Have you figured out how to do that? But conversely, listen to them. If you have a student who's struggling, ask them what is wrong. What could I do to be a more effective teacher for you? Listen to them. Ask them questions. I like students who challenge me. I've learned a lot from them. By the same token, depending on your experience level, I can handle challenges from a student now that there's no way I could have handled 10 years ago. No way, heck, I could have handled 20 years ago. I would have choked up, had no answer. But the nice thing is if they challenge you, you either know the answer and you give it to them, which means you've communicated information and done better training, or you don't know the answer and you better look it up because you should have known that anyways. And I have sanded off a lot of rough edges of my own surgical technique over the years because someone taught me how to do something and maybe it was something small and I never questioned it. And when a student questions it and I look at it, I realize I shouldn't be doing that. Or there's a better way to do that. And those challenges make you a better surgeon, never mind a better trainer. If I'm wrong, I should change it. If my student has a better idea, I should change it. So this is my personal favorite example of this. One of my senior people at a previous place of employment, Renee, was going through training and she had real gifts as a surgeon, but she also had a really analytical mind. So if you look at this, basically I have a mouse and a stereotaxic setup that's isoflurane going through the blue tube to a little nose cone that comes out the white tube. And I spent 10 years, I wish I was lying, but 10 years forcing my students to work to the stopwatch. You anesthetize your animal with isoflurane, you've got 45 to 60 seconds to get them in this, in ear bars in the stereotaxic device, and get the isoflurane to them or they're going to wake up. And it was hell for them. Really hard. Putting an animal in stereotax is a tough skill, especially a mouse or even a rat. And so they go through it and they learn and they learn. So I sat there with Renee and she looked at it and she looked at me and she said, "But that's dumb." I looked at her and I'd like to think to my credit, I went, "Why?" And she looked down and she said, "Well, I can just move this nose cone over them whenever they wake up, let them go fully back to sleep, and then I can continue repositioning them. I don't have to keep taking them out, re-anesthetizing them in the chamber, putting them back." And I looked at her and my mouth dropped slightly open. And I realized that she was absolutely right. Ever since then, I teach that to my students, and it's so much easier. But had I not been willing to listen to her, had I just shut her down, I never would have learned that. That's only one tiny piece of me as a teacher that was improved, because I've been blessed with really good students, and I'm blessed with students who, if what I'm saying isn't clear or doesn't make sense, they challenge me on it, and they should. Because I'm going to set them off to work, and if I tell them to do something that's wrong, they're going to do it wrong. If I tell them something that doesn't make sense, they won't be able to do it effectively. But again, less experienced teachers can't handle that level, and that's okay. I'm sure 10 years from now I'll be able to handle challenges from students that I can't handle now. It gets back to the training, but it also gets back to listen to your students. So what does this mean overall? Your training staff is critical, and I always leave this when I train new trainers, and some of it is to just scare the heck out of them, I admit it, but some of it, honestly, is because I really do believe this, and I think most of the good teachers and trainers out there, I'm blessed with a fantastic training staff. My training coordinator, Sabrina, my principal In-vivo trainer, Ron, my surgical trainer, Jen, who've taken on a ton of work here for me, are fantastic, and they have this same mentality. You as a trainer are going to have a massive impact on an individual's career and their success in their lab and their success in their career. If you're the first person training them, you're setting the standard. You're giving them their foundation. If you're a good teacher, you make good scientists. If you're a mediocre teacher but you have a well-structured program, you can make good scientists. If you're a bad teacher, if you don't want to be in there or you're not taking this seriously, that foundation that you're giving your student is a poor one. I tried earlier of the falling apart house. That's what you're doing to them. And I have seen it. I've had students who've been doing things and they had terrible teachers once upon a time. Some of them we've been able to work with and get them to where they ideally should have been, and some of them can never overcome that. And I have seen surgeons who probably could have been really good. At best were mediocre, have possibly dropped out of it. You are about to have a tremendous impact on the careers and really the science that your students are going to do. Don't take it lightly. It's important. that, I'm done. So if there are questions, comments, or concerns, we are going to run through and, the best I can, answer them. So I'm going to run down the list, but please continue to put more of them out. So surgeon fatigue is the first one. So the question is, how do you deal with it?
Thank you, Mr. Flegel, for your presentation. A quick reminder for our audience on how to submit questions. Simply type them in the Q&A box found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. Mr. Flegel will answer as many questions as time permits. So let's hop over and take a look at the questions. And let's see, the first question asks today, how do you deal with surgeon fatigue?
Okay, surgeon fatigue. So there are a couple of different ways to approach that. One is the actual fatigue. And there are so many things in here that you could spend hours talking about. But ergonomics are so important. I focus on them in my training. Again, it's a buzzword that I used to laugh at. But I will tell you, in my early stages of teaching, and I didn't focus on it, I've had students who washed out of surgery, not because they wouldn't have been capable, because I as a teacher didn't know enough to teach them how not to hurt themselves. So positioning your hands in neutral positions, stabilizing your forearms, keeping your shoulders in a rested neutral position, taking breaks. There's a whole series of pieces on it that you could address, but the most basic way I can do for surgeon fatigue is neutral shoulder position, lots of bracing. Arms should be braced, ideally hands should be braced. Teach good instrument fundamentals. Teach how to hold an instrument in what I call living fashion, which means it can flexibly move throughout your hand, is a huge advantage. It sounds trite, but the most basic rule I teach when I teach surgical ergonomics is if it hurts, you probably shouldn't do it, and you should find an alternative way to do it. By the same token, especially large animal surgery where you typically are standing, it's going to be exhausting. Again, walk around, move, don't let your joints lock up, don't rest your weight on your forearms. I would really focus on the ergonomics of it and start them off early. The very first hands-on training I give when I have students is that hands-on. How do you hold an instrument? How do you manipulate it? How do you figure out a neutral grip? How do I keep my shoulders from getting strained? How do I avoid excessive wrist rotation and pronation and what have you? Focus on the ergonomics. That's my best answer for that.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. Do you have any information on how transgenic mice recover from surgery? Do they recover worse than other mice?
So my best answer to that is yes, no, maybe. And what I mean by that is where I've worked, especially when I was working at Genzyme, we were almost universally a transgenic shop. And transgenics, some of them are significantly hardier than others. And unfortunately, until you've worked with that particular strain, you don't know. By and large, I have found that genetically manipulated animals tend to be less robust. They don't recover as well. With mice in particular, keep them warm, keep them oxygenated is critical, and that oxygenation is critical, especially if you're using injectables. I've been blessed with fantastic direct reports and staff over the years, and several years back, one of my senior people, Teresa, did a wonderful series of experiments where she measured the effects of putting your animal on 100% oxygen with injectable anesthetics. Short version of this, it was an Academy of Surgical Research presentation. I believe it's available online. But the short version of this is you let that animal breathe room air on, say, a ketamine, xylazine, acepromazine cocktail. Their O2 saturation drops down into the high 50s, low 60s in about 15 to 30 seconds, which if you were in a veterinary clinic and you had an animal presenting that way, you put them on oxygen immediately. It's a life-threatening emergency. So there are times that I'm amazed that our animals survive at all. Put them on 100% oxygen, their O2 saturation jumps to 98 in about 10 seconds. You take it away, it drops again in 15 to 30. So yes, commonly transgenic mice don't recover as well. They have prolonged recovery times. They are more sensitive to complications afterwards. I've seen them where there's a higher incidence of wound dehiscence, so your closure is important. Using things like tissue adhesive properly can be a huge help. But yeah, recovery, I tend to run them on a lighter anesthetic dose if it's an inhalant, or if it is an injectable, if I have to use an injectable, I put them on oxygen and keep them on heat. And for heaven's sakes with mice, again, most of us, you probably already know this, and I apologize for telling you things you already know. Water recirculating heating pads do diddly squat. There's barely any heat transfer, but they're relatively cheap and we use them a lot. Warm air blowers, again, it seems excessive, but if you have a transgenic mouse where each one is worth $500, boy, the cost of that heating unit suddenly seems a lot more reasonable. Electric heating plates, immersive beanbag style ones like Shoreline used to make, use them. So yeah, I tend to see them recover more slowly, although some of them surprise me. So it's what you're doing during the anesthetic procedure that will kind of save you and honestly save them as well.
Thank you. Our third question for the day asks, I did decapitation, IV infusion, and minor surgery. How do I improve after a long time? With no employment in the field?
So that's a good question. That's a really good question. It's also a really hard question, but the good news is there's actually a fair amount you can do. Depending on your focus, generalized surgical knowledge is essential. So if you have an internet account, which obviously you do because you're watching this, Google, do research. There's so much material on the university websites. There's so much for free that is out there. So learn the basics of aseptic technique. Look through the things that are on university websites. There's a whole host of materials. And before I get too much deeper into this, at the end, they will give you contact information. Please feel free to pass on, and they'll put you and I in touch, and there's more that we can do. But I will tell you, do the research, learn. If you have that type of knowledge, then it will help you tremendously to learn the physical skills. For the physical skills, instrument handling, ergonomics, dexterity, I don't know if this will show up too well. I'm going to use a pen for this. It's going to sound silly. Get a pair of scissors, grab one from around your house, and just get used to manipulating them back and forth. Get your fingers in the rings, palm the instrument, move it back and forth, transfer it to the other hand. These types of basic instrument dexterity exercises will be a huge godsend for you. Beyond that, again, go to YouTube, go to Jove, go to things like this conference on the internet. And there's a ton of really good video out there that will talk you through how to do it. Now, the sticking point is going to be being able to get in and practice those techniques. But a lot of things, basic suturing and dissection. You want to practice basic dissection? get an X-Acto blade, go to your hobby shop, go to your hardware store, practice on things like skinned chicken breast. You can both make your meal and practice your surgical techniques at the same time, but it's the same skill. You're still learning dissection. You're still learning incision creation. If you want to suture, is it optimal to be practicing with needle and thread? Nope. But can you learn the basics of suture patterns and how to bring things together? Absolutely. Is it better to train with needle holders? Sure it is. If you have a hobby shop around, especially a model store, it's amazing how many surgical instruments, the really cheap ones, but still surgical instruments in design, you can buy for $10, $15, $20, and all of a sudden you can practice your suturing. You can practice your tissue dissection. Considering how much I push my students into using those resources, you get a lot out of it. So just because you're not in the field doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to learn a tremendous amount about surgery. So there you go. But yeah, reach for the contacts at the end, and there's more that we can work on. I would be happy to help.
If there are no more questions today, I would like to once again thank Mr. Flegel for his presentation. Do you have any final comments today?
Well, I have lots and lots of final comments, but in the interest of time and people being able to get on with their day, just a couple. So one, if you're setting up a program, think about all the constraints that we talked about early on and have those questions answered before you create your structure. The other piece is, if you're a teacher, please take it seriously. The impact that you're going to have on your students' lives can be really profound. I mean, you can change people's careers path. All of us who've been teaching this for a while have had people who had no interest in surgery. You got a hold of them and suddenly it's their whole career, in many cases for the rest of their lives. Don't take that lightly. They're putting a lot of themselves into your hands, so please take it seriously and do the best that you can for them. If you can do that, you're probably going to be a pretty good teacher. And that would be about it.
I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today. We would also like to thank LabRoots for today's educational webcast. This webcast can be viewed on demand through May 2017. LabRoots will alert you via email when it is available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. I'll see you next time here at labroots.com. Goodbye.